This is part 2 of the Ontario Hazelnut IPM workshop series for 2021, Eastern Filbert Blight. My name is Melanie Filitas, and I am a horticulture integrated pest management specialist with the Ontario Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Rural Affairs. Throughout this series, we will be discussing a number of pest problems common to Ontario hazelnut orchards, including their identification, biology, how to monitor for them, as well as some general management practices. The first pest we're going to discuss in this workshop series is Eastern Filbert Blight. This is the most serious disease and actually pest problem of hazelnuts in North America, and it is one of the main limiting factors to the commercial production of hazelnuts in Ontario. Eastern Filbert Blight, or EFB for short, is caused by the fungus Anisogramma anomala, and it causes cankers, dieback, and death of susceptible hazelnut cultivars. So the fungus grows under the bark for a large portion of its life cycle, and that characteristic causes some issues with the timely management and identification of this disease, and we'll get into that in the coming slides. Just starting with a little bit of history on the disease in North America. As the name implies, Eastern Filbert Blight is native to the eastern half of North America, where it evolved with the Native American hazelnut species present here. On these native trees, it causes only minor symptoms, but it is lethal to the European hazelnut species, which are more desirable for confectionery purposes. Originally, Eastern Filbert Blight was restricted to the eastern half of the continent, and so it wasn't present in either Europe or Oregon when commercial production of European varieties really began to ramp up about 100 years ago. But a strain of the disease was accidentally introduced west of the Rocky Mountains approximately in the 1960s, and then it spread. And eventually it caused major losses to the hazelnut industry in Oregon and Washington. So that's led to quite a bit of research, mainly in Oregon, into breeding for resistance and developing pest management techniques. And that's really formed the basis of what we know about how to manage this disease. And that means that our current guidelines for EFB management, which we're using here in Ontario, do come from the West Coast. So we just need to keep in mind that the West Coast has different environmental conditions than we do. And environment really does impact the biology of the disease. And they also have fewer strains of the fungus present than we do, which means that trees that are resistant to the strains present in Oregon are not necessarily as resistant to the strains that we have in Ontario. So certainly we use these as a guideline. It's very helpful in figuring out how to manage the disease. But as research is done in Ontario on how the biology works under our environmental conditions, we will probably be fine-tuning our management techniques in future years. Eastern Filbert Blight has a fairly complicated multi-year life cycle. It's important to understand that life cycle because it really has implications on the management of the disease. So I'm going to start in the upper right-hand portion of this life cycle figure in the spring. So actually at the time of recording this, it's spring, it's May of 2021. So imagining the orchards right now, this is the prime infection period. So spores that are existing in mature cankers are released and they infect young tissue. And Eastern Filbert Blight can only infect young actively growing stem tissue, so that's breaking buds and very young shoot tips. And so you need a combination of this young tissue and then wet conditions, which are necessary for the spore release and for the infection of tissue by the spores. So you'll have infection beginning at bud break in the spring and persisting until dry conditions dominate and the cankers and the stromata, which are the spore-containing structures, are empty, which in Oregon, it tends to be towards the end of May, but in Ontario, we think it's likely to be a little bit later, probably towards the end of June. So then here's a very important feature of Eastern Filbert Blight, and that is that once the fungus has penetrated that young tissue, it enters the cambium and phloem and grows within the tree. So it is under the bark and it then enters a 15 to 18 month latent period where there are no visible signs of infection. So going back to our description, so this is going to be June of 2021. There will be an infection. The fungus will be actively growing, but there will be no external sign of the disease in the fall of this year or the winter. The first indication that a grower might have that they have an infection in that branch might come in late spring of the following year, so late spring of 2022 in our example. So this is year 2. And the spore-bearing structures called the stomata will begin to form underneath the bark, and what you'll start to see probably in mid to late June would be these raised bumps in the bark. And then in summer of that year 2, what you'll see is those stomata, those spore-bearing structures, will start to erupt, probably about early July. They'll initially be white, but by fall they will have matured and they will have turned black. So it takes from spring of one year through all the way through to fall of the following year before you see these mature stomata, and those stomata are usually contained within cankers, which will be sunken areas in the bark. By winter of that year, the stomata have these mature spores, but because it's cold, the fungal activity is thought to cease. So then things are kind of frozen or suspended for the winter. And then in spring of the 3rd year, the spores within those stomata containing cankers are ejected during warm, rainy periods. So just so that you're understanding then, the infections that we're experiencing in the spring, in sort of May, June of 2021 in the upper right corner, you will not actually have those erupting and looking like mature cankers until the fall of 2022, and they will not start to infect other trees until the spring of 2023. So it's a very prolonged period between infection and then sporulation of the canker. So one of the really big implications, just going back here to this fall, is that any cuttings taken in the summer, fall, or winter of the year after infection could contain fungus within the tree parts and be spread to other orchards or other areas of the orchard without you knowing it, because there will be no external signs of the disease. So that's really important to be aware of when you're doing any kind of cutting or work in the orchard. So going back to our year 3 and beyond, the spores will infect new material, but the fungus that is within the canker, it's not restricted to that canker. It's going to continue to grow. So I'm just drawing, highlighting this area in the upper left of this diagram, where you will see new stomata beginning to form, and those cankers within the tree get bigger and bigger. And then eventually those expanding cankers can girdle and kill branches and entire trees. So in very susceptible varieties, you can get death of the tree from both the expanding canker and from new infections from other sporulating cankers within 3 to 7 years. So for major symptoms of Eastern Filbert Blight, I'm going to be directing you to the center picture here. This is sort of a classic example of Eastern Filbert Blight. So we have a sunken area, that's the canker, and within the canker you have these raised black spore-bearing structures called stomata, and they're running lengthwise in more or less straight rows up and down the canker. Those are more visible in winter when the foliage is not there. The tree cells within this canker are dead. But this is what you would see in the fall when the cankers are mature. Earlier on in the season, when the fungus is first present, what you might see are just sort of raised bumps in the bark. So right here in the left picture, what you can see is the sunken area, that's the canker, and you can see the bumps, which are those black stomata that are just beginning to push on the bark from the inside of the tree. So those erupt through in midsummer, and then this is sort of what you can see as they get older, but you basically see the canker, which isn't always as sunken, but if you look at this figure on the right, you sort of see these often oblong stomata sort of just poking out of the cankers. So while cankers are the most characteristic feature of Eastern Filbert Blight disease, as I mentioned before, they can be difficult to see in the summer when there's lots of leaves on the tree, and also often in the summer they haven't quite gotten as dark black as they do in late fall. So in summer, the most obvious symptom that we have from Eastern Filbert Blight would be something that we refer to as flagging. And essentially that happens when the canker girdles the twig or branch, kills the branch, and the leaves that are on that branch, they die, but they tend to remain attached to the branch. So what you have is this very distinctive dead branch standing out amongst the living foliage. So this is a photo from Oregon, and you can see there's lots of flagging. These trees are very severely affected and they really stand out. In Ontario, we don't see this degree of flagging yet. So what you will see though is, if you look in the upper right photo, just the odd branch that stands out with all these dead leaves sticking out from the living foliage. That isn't necessarily caused by Eastern Filbert Blight. Other things can kill branches, but it is a clue that it might be there. So what you would want to do then is go closer to this tree. You would want to follow this flagging branch down to the base of the dead leaves and look for signs of a canker at the base of the tree. Now, while flagging is a really helpful clue to look for Eastern Filbert Blight and certain other diseases, it is important to be aware that Eastern Filbert Blight can be present without flagging, because flagging happens once the canker has girdled the entire branch and killed it. So if it is a large branch and the canker isn't entirely girdling it, you can have a canker without flagging. But at the same time, it does really help indicate that the disease may be present in the orchard when you see flagging. Where cankers form on main trunks, that can eventually kill the entire tree, and the death of the tree will happen sooner on very susceptible varieties than it will on more resistant varieties. So with work that we have done in Ontario, things like Tonda will go down within a few years with Eastern Filbert Blight, whereas with our experimental planting in Simcoe, we have only just started to see Filbert Blight on Yamhill varieties after 10-15 years. We do have a number of resistant cultivars growing in Ontario orchards. It is important to be aware that these resistant trees can get infected by Eastern Filbert Blight, but that the tree has a capacity for dealing with the disease and preventing it from spreading and killing it. So what that means is you can find cankers on resistant cultivars. So as you can see in this figure on the left, what you will see in a resistant cultivar is a canker that looks more like a crack. It might be a flat or sunken area. There may or may not be stromata, but they would be smaller. And over time, those cankers will become calloused and healed over as the tree's defenses are activated, and it basically walls off the pathogen, prevents it from spreading further down the branch. Monitoring for Eastern Filbert Blight should be done several times a year. So while you are out pruning and doing other activities in the orchard, of course, if you see cankers, you're going to want to go in and flag those for later removal. But you also should try to do some dedicated scouting for cankers at least 2 to 3 times a year. In the summer, that's relatively easy. You can keep an eye out for cankers while you're doing routine monitoring for other pests. At that time, you're going to be looking for flagging branches on trees. Just look for cankers there. And in the summer, it may not look like the classic cankers. It may be like in the lower left photo, these white spots, which are the young stromata that have just emerged through the bark. But of course, in the summer, as we mentioned, it's a little bit more difficult to find cankers. So it is a good idea after the leaves have fallen in the fall, when you're done your other scouting, to go out and have a specific scout looking for Eastern Filbert Blight cankers. And those can be quite high on the tree, so it's important to have a look with binoculars to look for cankers that might be above your head, your normal height sight lines. And to go in. And then when you see those, you're going to want to flag those, because those cankers should be removed from the orchard. Eastern Filbert Blight management really requires a multi-pronged approach. It's not enough to just go in and spray. So there are 4 main areas you can focus on when managing for Eastern Filbert Blight. The first is to choose resistant or tolerant varieties wherever possible. The second is the removal of any infected material you might see and the destruction of those cuttings. Fungicides are helpful, especially with more susceptible varieties, and those need to be applied shortly after bud break. And then the use of clean planting material. And by clean planting material, that goes back to the fact that Eastern Filbert Blight can have that really long, year-long latent period where there are no visible symptoms of the tree. So it's sourcing from areas, especially if you're sourcing susceptible varieties, sourcing from propagators that are having a vigilant Eastern Filbert Blight management protocol. So I'm going to zero in a little bit more on the first 3 points in my next few slides. So first, let's talk about resistant varieties. Of course, that is sort of the goal. There's been quite a lot of work done in Ontario to find varieties that are resistant to Eastern Filbert Blight, and there have been cultivar trials being done by the University of Guelph dating back to 2008. So I just want to show you the results of the oldest trial, which I have posted on this slide. The first thing I want to flag is these three varieties. They're Gamma, Jefferson, and Yamhill. And what you can see is that these are varieties that were taken from Oregon and reported in Oregon to be resistant to Eastern Filbert Blight. But in the Ontario cultivar trials, we did observe Eastern Filbert Blight in all three of these varieties. And this relates back to what I was talking about in an earlier slide. The Oregon breeding program is done in an area which only has one or two strains of the disease present because it was introduced there. Here in Ontario, we have several more strains, and so it seems that these varieties are not as resistant to all strains as they are to the couple of strains that they were bred for in Ontario. There are, though, a number of Ontario varieties sort of coming from Ontario farms and propagators or from Eastern New York, and so far we have not seen Eastern Filbert Blight in any of those varieties, so those are good choices if you're looking for really Eastern Filbert Blight tolerant varieties. However, it's important to be aware that most of the cultivars that they identified as not getting Eastern Filbert Blight are not currently acceptable to Ferrero, which is a major market for some Ontario growers. So there is a new research trial going in that is evaluating some newer cultivars from Rutgers and Oregon that are thought to have a broader range of resistance to Eastern Filbert Blight. So hopefully in the future we will be identifying some new cultivars. But it is important to be aware that tolerant or resistant varieties are a critical part of Eastern Filbert Blight management, but they are not the only part of the solution. They should be used as part of an integrated program. So even when you have some of these tolerant varieties in your orchard, you still need to scout, you still need to look for Eastern Filbert Blight. So when you do find cankers, whether it is a very susceptible or a very tolerant variety, you want to be removing those cankers from the orchard, and you want to be doing that in the winter before bud break, when those cankers can then start to release spores and infect new trees. And so that's why scouting is so important. You want to catch those cankers when they first appear. When you find the canker, you want to be pruning it 2 to 3 feet below the point of infection because the fungus will extend beyond the canker. So you want to remove all the fungus, not just the part that has started to produce spore-bearing structures. Where those cankers are on really severely infected trees and where pruning would cut into the main trunk, or if you have a really susceptible cultivar, you might want to consider tree removal. Because the fungus may be so widespread throughout the tree that pruning is not going to be removing the disease. You want to be thinking about sanitizing your cutting tools before you move on to other trees, just to prevent any spread of both Eastern Filbert Blight and bacterial diseases. And you want to be destroying those infected cuttings prior to bud break. So here you can see this is the middle of the winter. They're putting the infected cuttings on the ground before they pick them up later. That's fine in the winter, but you want those out of the orchard before bud break happens because the cankers on those cuttings can reinfect or will have live spores that could reinfect. So timing is good the fall after harvest or late winter and early spring when freezing temperatures are not expected. And just remember, though, that you're not going to remove all infections. You'll have some symptomless infections in the tree, so you'll have to be pruning those again the following year. So really, every winter, you want to be planning on pruning for Eastern Filbert Blight. So this figure just illustrates why it's so important to prune well below the site of the canker. So at the end of this branch, you can see the pruning cut that would have been made in the winter of 2020. So this is 1 year ago, and they pruned below the canker, but they didn't prune far enough because what you can see is in the fall of 2020, winter 2021, which is when I took this picture, you can see that there is more Eastern Filbert Blight. So the canker expanded. And so there was symptomless infection there, obviously, when they made the first pruning cut, and it appeared as cankers the following year. So, and again, as I mentioned, when you have made the cuttings and you have put them down, you want to be getting those out of the orchard as soon as possible. So this was a late pruning done in a research orchard, and just a close-up down here. All of these cuttings are infected with Eastern Filbert Blight, and it's a rainy day. So those stomata, even though they have been removed from the tree, they can still release spores, which can cause new infections within the orchard. So you do want to get those out of the orchard as soon as you can, especially if it is after bud break. Ideally, you want that pruning to be done well before bud break. So you don't want this to happen. This is something that I have seen a lot, where all the cutting has been left to one side of the orchard, because again, this can still infect. So you want to burn or bury these infected cuttings, get them out of the orchard. So finally, just touching a bit on fungicides, which often are required, especially with susceptible varieties. The full list of fungicides that are registered for use against Eastern Filbert Blight on hazelnuts in Ontario can be found in OMAFRA's publication 360E, our crop protection guide for tree nuts, which I've discussed in more detail in the first webinar of this workshop series. But the important thing to be aware of is all of the registered products are only preventative. So this means that putting the fungicide on after the fungus has penetrated the bark will have no effect. They are meant to be on before the spores land and can germinate and infect the tree. So the timing is very important, and it is important to get good coverage. All susceptible tissue needs to be covered with these fungicides to prevent those infections from happening to begin with. So spray timing should begin at bud break. That's the period where those actively growing tissue appears. And then you want to continue those sprays approximately every 2 weeks until prolonged wet periods end. So in Oregon, they generally recommend about 4 sprays. So they generally finish at the end of May. But in Ontario, our rainy conditions tend to persist for quite a bit longer than they do. So it is possible that sprays will need to continue through June if it's really, really rainy and there's lots of susceptible tissue presence. Also, Eastern Filbert Blight can develop resistance to fungicides, so it's important to rotate between fungicide groups. So you don't want to just pick one fungicide that you think really works well and only apply that. You need to rotate to prevent that resistance. If you are growing tolerant varieties, it is certainly possible that fewer sprays may be needed, or possibly they may not be at all. But it is important to be aware that even in Oregon, with varieties like Jefferson, which is considered to be resistant or highly tolerant over there, they still do apply sprays during the first year after planting, because they found that in the very young trees they can get cankers. So that's something that we will hopefully gain more experience with, or more knowledge about, as we gain more experience with these tolerant varieties in Ontario. And that concludes our presentation on Eastern Filbert Blight in Ontario hazelnuts. Just a reminder of the resources available for Ontario hazelnut growers, available either currently or in the future on the OMAFRA website. And these are discussed in more detail in the first webinar of this Hazelnut IPM workshop series. So thank you for listening to this presentation. I've listed my contact information on this slide, and you can email me with any questions or comments. I also encourage you to subscribe to our blog at onspecialtycrops.ca, which gives timely information on specialty crops in Ontario, including hazelnuts.